Hello and welcome. Thank you all for coming. My name is Pavel Babushko. I work as the deputy head of the Center for Russian Studies. Our center primarily deals with Russia, Russian economy, politics, and Eastern European relations, and we try to often feature distinguished scholars who come to us to teach about a variety of subjects to do research. It's an honor for us to host Professor William Raizinger from University of Iowa, who's been faculty member since 1985. I believe he's a well-renowned scholar, published many books. One of the latest ones is Russia's Regions and Comparative Subnational Politics, published by Routledge in 2012. And he also wrote over 50 articles on the topic of political science. So without further ado, Professor Raizinger.
Thank you very much, Pavel. Nice to see everyone again. So this is part 2 of the series of 3 lectures. And yesterday I was trying to describe the discipline of political science globally and as I am familiar with it. And I want today then to follow up on yesterday's discussions by talking about how we do political science. And I say do political science, and what I mean is conduct political science research. And I use the word empirical in the title, and I want to remind you something I mentioned yesterday, which is when I say empirical, what I'm referring to is this idea of testing our ideas against the developments in the world, so what is going on in the world around us. And that does not necessarily mean only one kind of research. It doesn't mean statistical or quantitative research. It also includes a variety of other ways of learning about the world around us. It's just this idea that we are going to take our theories and test them against the real world. And so I wanted today sort of introduce you to how we think about doing that and the process we go through in producing research results in the form of an article or eventually a book or some other kind of publication. As we try to come up with things that help us understand the world of politics, which covers so much ground. So as you see, I'm going to start by talking about the role of theory in all this, in particular, and how theory leads into particular ways of studying politics. These are the empirical part, or what we often call methodology, or methods, in political research. Okay, and it's very closely connected to theory. Right? And then I want to talk about these list of logics of inquiry, which I will explain that term in a bit. And after having done that and talking about different ways that people do political science research at present, I want to then give you just a few tips or a few suggestions that I have about publishing political science research articles primarily in journals. Okay, so I hope I can get through this material and look forward to your questions. So I want to talk about theory then in the following way. So first thing is, if you're interested in politics, if you find something about national politics or local politics or the world politics to be interesting, it's usually really easy to discover some topic that you think is fascinating. Okay, so it might be a civil wars, or it might be civil society. It might be some sort of conflict around the world. It might be finance. It might be elections, on and on. There are so many topics that are interesting about politics. But in order to begin researching the world of politics, the first step, the thing that everyone has to do, and that is sometimes not as easy to do, is to come up with a question. To turn your topic into a question. All right, so the topic might be civil wars, or elections, or public opinion, or whatever, right? But when you have the topic, you don't really know what to do concretely. Right? It's only when you turn that into some sort of question that you at least have the beginnings of the path toward conducting research. Right? So when you have formulated not just what I'm interested in, but what question I want to answer, then you can say, well, okay, I think I can start to think about what I need to do to answer that question. Okay, at least sets you on the road to doing that. And about these questions, so one thing to note is that the question that you create out of your interests, that's often the very first thing that you write in an article. There's many influential articles, if you look at them, that have been published, and the research question is the very first sentence. Okay? Not all of them, it's not required. Sometimes you write some other things first, but usually within the first 2 paragraphs, you tell the reader what's your research question. Okay? So I always want to stress to my students and to others, don't just think about a topic to study, think about a question to answer. Now the good news is that you don't have to come up with a question that no one else has ever thought of. You do not have to invent an entirely new question. Because there's plenty of questions that we don't yet have good answers for. Right? There's lots of questions that can be studied in better ways. So a lot of political science research takes an old question and tries to study it in a new way, or to study it in a new place. Okay? And those are perfectly good things to do. So one of the things when you're trying to turn a topic into a question to do is to read what others have written, right? Whether it's something published within the last few years, or whether maybe it's something Aristotle wrote, and see what kind of questions other scholars are asking. And that will help you start to see ways in which you can come up with a question that might be worth answering for yourself. Now about questions, the best kind of question for you to pursue, for you to spend time trying to answer, is one that is a puzzle. So we talk about puzzles in research. And what I mean by that is something where the facts that you observe cannot easily be explained by previous research or what we already know. Okay? Something that to you seems unusual. Why did this happen? Why did this result? Or very commonly, why did this result happen in this country or this place, but not over here? Or why did this used to happen and doesn't today? So those kind of comparisons. Things that make you say, that's maybe something that I don't immediately see the answer to. Okay, so that kind of question. Some question of, we would like to know the answer to that question because it puzzles us. And I'll also tell you, many of you know if you've tried to write things for research reports of one sort or another, that there's this portion of it that should involve you describing other scholars' research. Okay? And we usually call it the literature review, other scholars' works. One of the things that's very hard to know is, what do I do with a literature review? Which ones do I talk about? Which ones do I not talk about? How do I write that review? What am I supposed to do with the literature review? Well, my advice is as follows. The point of a literature review, the purpose of that portion of any article or paper, is to explain to the reader why the question you have, why your question, is in need of answering. Okay? That's what the literature review is supposed to do. Based on what other people have done, previous studies, previous research, what we know from other people's scholarship, we don't understand this yet. Okay? These other people have done this work, but taken all together, these things don't give us a good answer to this question. Okay? So the literature review is to explain that there's not a perfectly good answer already existing. Okay, here's why we need to have an answer to this question. And it does give you some guidance to say, well, I don't need to talk about this article or that book because it doesn't help me explain to people why they should why they should read about my research. Okay, why we should answer this question. So it's the question you ask that guides you in terms of actually writing portions of your article, which is this idea of the literature review. All you need to do for the literature review is not make it as long as possible, actually make it as short as possible. Just explain that the previous work that's been done leaves your question still needing to be answered. Okay, so you have a question that you think is a good one. Right? Something about the political world, this fascinates me, this really puzzles me. I'd like to know what the answer to it is. The next step is to come up with a theory. So the three political scientists from Harvard came up with this definition of a theory in the social sciences, probably also in the physical sciences. That's pretty simple. You see that they define a theory as an answer to a question. Okay, so they're also thinking about research as beginning with a research question and trying to answer it. Okay, that's what we're doing when we're theorizing. Now they say that it should be a very precise answer, and it should explain why that answer should be correct. But basically what they're saying is when we theorize, when we create a theory, we're talking about answering some research question. Which ought to relieve you. That's pretty simple in a way. On the other hand, maybe not. Maybe it's less simple than you might think. My guess, though, is that all of you here can theorize about things. Why? Because theorizing is telling yourself a story about why this phenomenon that you see that puzzles you, why these kinds of results, these outcomes, these behaviors, these political events, why they're happening. Right? Tell it as a process. So the way to get started on theorizing is to start thinking about stories of what happened. Okay, let me show you a quote from a famous scholar of international relations, international politics, named Dina Zinnes. I will let you kind of read that, but that's the full quotation. But what I want you to draw your attention to is that she is describing the way that she creates theories of international relations as being like a detective story. So I don't know if maybe any of you thought this way before, but one of the really nice things about being a political scientist is you get to be like Sherlock Holmes. You guys all know Sherlock Holmes, right? Yes, I know he's very popular in Russia. Anybody seen the series from Britain recently in the last few years from Sherlock Holmes? Very popular television series. Oh no? Oh, okay. You should watch it. It's been very popular in different countries, and the star of it, who plays Sherlock Holmes, I guess, is considered very sexy. So there's my recommendation. All right. So I'm just giving you time to read the quotation of Pina Zinus. I find this very fascinating as a way to think about theory in the social sciences. Okay, so I don't know if it maybe doesn't seem very scientific, but that's the process. Tell yourself a story. Why is it that a student protest in this country led to the overthrow of the government, but student protest in another country caused no change whatsoever? Okay. Maybe you think, all right, that's very puzzling, I don't get it. Why would that be? Well, let me start telling myself a story, maybe, you know, this or that, and you start explaining to yourself what might have happened to make that possible. Okay, so this, I've already mentioned step one of creating political science theory, get a puzzling question. Step two, tell yourself a story to answer that question. Step three, then, is to generalize your story. So we want our theories not just to answer one question, not just to tell us about something very specific. We want our theories to be ones that will eventually sort of become explanatory of more things, that will help us understand many things. And often all it takes to do that is to change words that are very specific into words that are more general. So maybe your story is about how, you know, involves Vladimir Putin, and you can change that to the word president, or even better, to the word executive branch leader, or something else more general, so that it will include presidents of other countries, prime ministers, what have you. Or maybe you're interested in the students in Hong Kong, and you want to change that to student social movements, or then you can generalize to something even broader, right? So these kind of things actually are fairly straightforward. You create something that now starts to look like a more general theory of politics. Right? And it started with you just imagining what was causing things to happen. The next step, after you've gone through those processes, you've created a sort of general answer to your question, a story that may answer your question. Ideally, you should go back and start over and do another one. Okay? Get at least one more. Because after all, most questions could potentially have multiple answers. There are many suspects in our detective story. And in your research, then you'll be able to say, I need to figure out whether this story is correct or that story is correct. And that will sort of be the guiding principle for you to follow in making decisions about what kind of research you do, what kind of research methods you employ. All right, so I've done this as steps. Step 1, Step 2, Step 3, Step 4, because I want you to think of it as something that is quite simple to do. It is like a recipe for cooking something, right? These are things that are straightforward. I think everyone is capable of it, and it will lead you very quickly then to say, all right, here's what I need to find out if I'm going to decide whether this story is correct or some other story is correct. Okay, and then you're in a position to begin doing your empirical research. Okay. Okay. The first rule for deciding what methods to use for actually doing your research, we always tell ourselves this, is that there's no one method of research that's correct for everyone, that's always correct, that's always the best. So no one can say, well, I need to use, everyone in the field of political science needs to use the same research method. Instead, the approach is, the philosophy of this is that it depends on your question. For some questions, one research method may be quite appropriate. Maybe you need to use statistics. For another question, though, maybe you need to use qualitative content analysis. So it really depends on the question. You can go to a political scientist who specializes in one kind of methods and explain that that method won't work for me, I need to do a different one. And they need to accept that it depends on what kind of research you're doing. So that's the first rule. You have a choice. You can pick research methodologies that you think will shed light on your questions and really give you the answers that you need. Okay? Might be quantitative, might be qualitative. There's different ways of going about it. But, of course, that doesn't mean that people don't disagree about methods, which one should be used, which one's better, etc. For much of the time that there's been the contemporary field of political science, there have been arguments about this. And back in 1971, a Dutch-American political scientist named Aaron Leipart tried to break out of the old debates and give people a better understanding of what the choices are. Okay, so he came up with 4 choices rather than just 2, rather than just quantitative and qualitative. And the way he did it was by trying to think about logic of inquiry. Okay, and so let me explain what I mean by a logic of inquiry. When we're doing research, when we're trying to answer our questions, we're going out and we're gathering information about the world of politics in some way or another. One of the problems is there's a lot of information out there, there's a lot of possibilities. It's really hard to tell whether the story that we have, our theory, is correct because so many other things might be going on. One of the main things about doing research in the social sciences and the human sciences is we're actually trying to rule out or control for things that we don't think are causes, that we don't think are influences on these political outcomes. We actually want to push aside as much as possible. And so the political scientist Aaron Leipart talked about the role in doing that, in controlling for things that are not important, that are unimportant, as a logic of inquiry. How do we study things so that we can rule out different kinds of factors, potential factors? So when someone says, oh, maybe it's this other thing, not your theory, but some other thing going on, you can say, no, I controlled for that. I know that that's not the reason. And he focused on 4. One is experiments. Right? Experiments, as you know, do it by how they put people into groups. And the second that he focused on was statistical analysis. The third, case studies. Okay. Go into depth and learn everything you can about a particular case. And the fourth was one that many people were doing at the time, but no one had given a name to. And that was to compare, to do case studies essentially, but for more than one case. To sort of compare in great detail, but 2, 3, 4, or some small number of different cases in a systematic way so that you could try to gain some knowledge from those comparisons. He called that the comparative method. Okay, so experiments, statistics, case studies, and comparative methods were the 4 that he brought to our attention now, whatever that is, 40-some years ago. Okay. So what I want to do is talk about each of the 4 in terms of, again, explaining the logic of inquiry, how they do that, how they help us understand things, what really matters and what does not matter. And then also talk a little bit about how our ability to use those different logics of inquiry have progressed and where they stand now. So I'm going to talk first about experiments. And again, I think you're all familiar with the idea of experiments is that the researcher controls everything from the beginning, so that a certain number of people go into group A, a certain number of people go into group B perhaps. Perhaps it's done randomly, or perhaps it's done in some other rule. Then one gets the medicine, one does not, or whatever it might be. And the scientist is in control in the sense that they can say, I have made sure that everything that might be a potential other factor, everything that I don't want to be a cause, I've controlled for, taken out of the explanation, and I can see, does this thing that I do want to investigate, is this really important? There's a lot of control over the whole situation with an experiment. Of course, that's one reason why experiments in political science used to not happen very often, because there weren't all that many things that you can study in a laboratory, in an experimental situation. Or we used to think there weren't that many. You can study political psychology that way. You can ask people questions about different things and have them play games and do certain kinds of activities, but you can't study revolutions very well with an experiment. Right? You can't ask a revolutionary party to go into one room and a different revolutionary party to go into a different room or something, right? So there's a lot of interest in the world of politics where it just seemed like experiments were not very likely to be rewarding to them. Okay, so for a long time, experiments were a very small sliver of the field of research. Leipart said that experiments were the best way to study politics, if you can, but there just aren't very many cases where you can. Okay. Well, now, since that time, experiments are much more important in political science for sort of two reasons. One is that the political psychology and the other uses of experiments that existed earlier have simply become more prevalent. So there's more work being done, more questions being asked, where the kind of experiments where you have people volunteer to participate and that sort of thing, where they're really relevant. Okay, so experimental work in political science has simply grown more common of that sort. The other thing is that there's greater now use of what are called natural experiments or field experiments. Now what this means is that the researcher doesn't control the situation as fully as a traditional experiment, but they find a situation in nature, they find a situation that occurs on its own that is like an experiment. Okay, so for example, perhaps one example that I remember from about two decades ago, 20 years ago, was that there was a newspaper strike in an American city. So this city went from everyone in the city having access to the media, the primary form of mass media at the time, to a period of, I think, 2 months or something, where they had no mass media, or they had no newspaper mass media. So they had television, I guess, but not the newspapers. So there was a before and an after. They had public opinion data, survey data from before and after, and they could then examine the role of the media on political opinions with a more of an experimental situation. Okay, so that's a natural experiment because it just happened. The researchers didn't cause it to happen. Okay. Unlike a situation where the researchers maybe sent people a letter and said, we will pay you $100 if you will not read a newspaper for 2 months. Right? You could do that. That would be a real experiment. But natural experiments sometimes just happen in ways that create the same kind of ability to rule out certain other factors. And in the case of the newspaper strike, there was a whole bunch of things that were not going to be influences. You could rule them out because it was the same city, the same people. Right? You were taking surveys of the exact same community. Whatever was their political culture before the strike and after the strike was the same. So you weren't going to be able to explain it by their political culture. Whatever was the level of education, it was going to be the same before and after. Right? So you immediately remove from possibility many types of answers. Okay. In that sense, nature presented to these scholars an opportunity to learn some things about the role of the media. Okay. So it's actually the case now that experiments, I think, are considered very possible within the study of political science and are done much more often. Now, statistical analysis, as you know, is something that has become a very large part of political science. Many of the research articles and journals will publish work with statistical results very commonly. And those who are trained to become researchers in political science are frequently given training in statistical analysis as a way of doing their own research or of understanding the research of others. Okay, so this is a big part of it. It has a different logic than experiments. Again, this is about how do we decide what matters and what does not matter. Okay, when we are given information about the world. In statistical analyses, the researcher doesn't control the world in the same way as with experiments. We go out and we get information about the world and we study it, but we don't make that information. We just have to take whatever the world creates. So we take our information, we don't manipulate it or control it, and then we try to learn from it. So with statistics, what you're doing is you are using these statistical techniques to try to say, let's hold these constant, which is a statistical idea of let's hold them at certain values, while we look at how these other things change. Okay, so that we can say, well, these things were not changing while these were, therefore these things are the important relationship. It's a way of taking what you've learned about the world and trying to, after the fact, after the occurrences have happened, after the events, to try to figure out what was going on. If that makes sense. It only makes sense, statistical analyses only make sense if you have a theory that tells you the pattern in the statistics, the pattern in the data, is what I expect based on my theory. Because you're trying to see if this answer is more likely, is more plausible, is more supported, well supported, based on these patterns of statistical analysis. So when Leipart was discussing this, he said, this is also a good method, a good way of trying to learn about the world. It's not as good as experiments, but it is often a good way. But again, of course, not all kinds of analyses are useful for statistics. Right? One of the things about doing statistical analyses is you have to reduce politics to numbers. Right? It's quantitative, it involves numbers. Many people find that very strange and not a good strategy for thinking about politics. On the other hand, many things in the political world are directly about numbers, the results of elections, for example. Other things can be measured and thought about numerically in ways that can help produce patterns and regularities that are useful for us to know. So there's many reasons to think that statistical analyses can be very useful. I hope you believe that. My work tomorrow is statistical, and so I believe that, so I hope I can convince you that that's useful. All right, so statistical analysis has, I think, really changed and become more interesting in the last recent years, last decade, 2 decades, in a variety of ways. I want to talk a little bit about that. now because it is a much more, the statistical features, these new developments in statistical analysis, I think are very important in the field right now. One of the reasons why statistical analysis has become very different and more important is just that computing power has gone way up. Okay, so we now can do statistical analyses that were very difficult when I started in the field. The second reason is that statistical analyses are, I think, a better tool, is we have the mathematics of it, the actual statistical techniques have become better. So statisticians and others have developed statistical techniques that are better at studying the things we want to study. Right? And then the third thing is the access to data. The access to numbers about the political world has gotten better. Okay? There are a lot of data sets out there that people can use in doing their work. And that's, of course, really, really crucial for doing political science research. Okay? So I don't have to say anything about the growth in computing power. I think that's probably pretty clear. But let me talk about the other two things, the statistical techniques. Okay? So let me ask first, do any of you do statistical analyses? Any of you been trained in statistics for the social sciences or anything like that? Okay. I'll go over this fairly briefly then. In political science research, the statistics that's used primarily has been what's called least squares regression, also called ordinary least squares, or some variant of that. Okay, something with fairly close to that. And that basically is just a way to, as I was describing before, focus in on the relationship between cause A and outcome B, while trying to statistically say these other things aren't important. Right? Now, one of the things about that form of statistics is you have to assume that the real world has certain properties. You have to make certain assumptions about the information you have, about the data you have, or else the conclusions you draw are not actually accurate. And that form of analysis, it violates the necessary assumptions if you have, for example, some of your information at one level of analysis and some at a higher level of analysis. Okay, so by level of analysis, people might be one level of analysis, and regions or states a higher level of analysis, countries a higher level of analysis. So that some of your information is actually embedded within and part of the phenomena at the higher level of analysis. Well, if that's the case, that actually violates one of the necessary assumptions for doing the most common form of statistical analysis. Okay, so one of the things that has been very useful for political scientists in recent years is the development of statistical techniques for multi-level analysis, which is a way to properly account for the fact that some of your cases, some of your information is embedded within higher levels of analysis. Okay, that there's a relationship between some of your information. Okay, you may have heard of a very well-known fallacy in studying information at different levels of analysis called the ecological fallacy. Things that are patterns that are true at one level of analysis may not be at a lower or higher level of analysis. And it's very easy for people to draw wrong conclusions if they're not aware of that. So one of the things I think has been good about statistical work in political science is greater use of these new tools so that they can take into proper account of the relationships of the things they're studying. And multi-level analyses are also called hierarchical analyses. Another area where the development of statistical techniques has been really important is what I call what is called network analysis. This is a new set of mathematical approaches that is trying to account for the fact that the relationship between two people or countries or whatever it might be, two phenomena, is often very much influenced by their relationships to other actors or other phenomena. Okay, so think of two countries, right? Their relationship between the two of them is going to be strongly influenced by each one's relationship to other countries, whether those other countries are enemies or allies or what have you, right? You take any two countries, they're not just isolated atoms relating to each other, they're part of a network. Right? Well, that network, again, requires particular statistical techniques and needs to be accounted for. It's now quite possible to do the kind of statistical analysis that will properly take that into account. Spatial techniques. I talked yesterday about the use of spatial analysis, taking into account the location and how people and countries and other phenomena are located, close to each other, far from each other, that sort of thing. Again, that's a new way of thinking, and to study it with statistical analysis requires new techniques. We're starting now to get those techniques, and it's very useful. And when I say that we have the techniques available, what I mean is that there are statistical programs that give you simple commands to carry out the analysis. Right? So it becomes practical for you to gather information, to have a data set, and to actually do the statistical analysis. Textual analysis, of course, refers to studying words and the use of words, and the ability to both gather and analyze texts has grown because of the computer power, because of now the ability to really process lots of information and look for patterns in documents. Right? So whereas 30 years ago, for someone to compare every speech given in the United Nations in a year or something would be impossible, right? It would take a year of someone's life, or probably a team of people a year. Now, the computer can do that very quickly. It can take all the text, right, of every speech given in the United Nations for a whole year, and it can start to, you can tell it, look for how many times someone says this word or that word, right? And that's all now very simple. But of course, that requires us to think about, what does it mean to study words, right? And so that has developed as well, and that's very useful for the quantitative or statistical analysis of these things. And so I think the tools we have for doing that kind of statistical analysis are really have grown in important ways. If you're going to do statistics, you need data. A lot of times we make our own data. We're interested in some phenomenon and we say, I want to compare, a bunch of cases here to see if the ones that have this characteristic really are more of this or something. And so we go out and we get it out of books or something else. We gather our information. If we think life expectancy is important, we go look it up in the reference books and we put the numbers in the computer and we make an Excel spreadsheet. We do all that work ourselves. For some things, that's the right way to do it, but for other things, that's pretty hard. That's a lot of work. Wouldn't it be nice if there was already information out there? What if you wanted to study the history of global warfare from the time of Napoleon to now? Right? That might actually be really important. You'd like to know about the future and keep our planet safe from future global wars. Let's look at what's happened in the past. Maybe it'd be nice to look at a long period of human history. So you get to the point where you say to yourselves, aha, I need to know every war that happened from 1815 through the present. Okay, now if you thought about that, maybe you say to yourselves, it's impossible. I would have to spend 30 years doing that. There's no way I could ever do that. Okay. Well, it turns out somebody else has already done that for you. You just have to go to the internet and download the file, and you actually can get all that information. So one of the great things about political science, and again, thinking about from the 1950s on, but even very much so from when I entered the profession in the 1980s till now, there's a huge number of data sets that are easily available. So for many, many different questions that are important in our field. So I went out and I tried to come up with some examples for you of topics or phenomena where we have easily available data sets. These were ones, I picked them in part because they won some awards for being innovative data sets that cover politics. Election results, constitutional provisions, many different topics, civil wars. So these are just meant to be examples. They don't even include what I was just talking about, the case of warfare. Right? I was talking about the Correlates of War project. Right? And there are now other data sets that are trying to come up with international conflict of different sorts. Anyway, for a variety of things that might interest you about politics, there are already data sets that are available, and in almost all cases it means go to a website and download the data in some format, Excel or something else. I had in the list of suggested readings document that we're going to make available, I have the URLs for all of these if you're interested, but I'm sure if you were interested it'd be no problem finding these. Okay. So there's just a lot of information out there that's very exciting and gives the possibility of doing really good research without having to kind of recreate all the information yourself. The other thing about what I like about having these things available readily is that the scholar who makes them gets feedback from other scholars. So they find errors sometimes, they can fix them and make them better. And that gives other people an excuse to try to come up with other data sets that maybe they see as an improvement. And in general, it makes our knowledge of the political world better because people are challenging each other about data sets. Big data. Have any of you heard that phrase before? It's starting to become more used in the media and such. So what's big about big data is the number of observations. Okay, so we used to think that we had a big data set, maybe if we had 200 countries over 20 years, and each country had some, there were 100 variables or something, so whatever that would be, 40,000 cases or something, right? But now, because of the internet and because of the textual analysis and other things, it's actually possible to have a data set with millions and millions of observations, maybe collecting things out of social media. So that's big in the sense that these data sets are huge, right? They just, now they become so big, in fact, that they challenge our ability to study them and really determine patterns and outcomes based on our analyses of them. So one example that I think is interesting that fits in this idea of big data is a study that was done by some researchers at Harvard. They were studying social media usage in China and trying to understand the Chinese government's control of their social media. And they came up with the following conclusion about how the Chinese government operates. They decided that in looking at millions and millions of communications and things that on Chinese social media, that the Chinese government did not want to stop criticism of the government. So it did not censor the people's communication with each other on social media. If people just simply said, I think the Communist Party is bad, or whatever. Right? If they criticize the government or the latest policies, or they said something, whatever, imagine two college students communicating through social media. Right? We know there's this great firewall of China that is controlling a lot of the internet there, and they have people who actively stop certain forms of communication. But it wasn't criticism. It wasn't information that was trying to oppose the government in that sense. What the Chinese government did, these scholars found, according to their study of all these millions of pieces of information, is the government moved very quickly to stop any communication that involved making plans for people to get together. So if you said anything about let's meet, let's go to this place and talk to each other, or let's go do this together, if it was about physical meeting, then the government stopped and cut it off. They tried to prevent people from getting together in groups. Okay? So they were not trying to, the Chinese, are evidently not trying to stop dissent among the population. They're trying to stop social mobilization. They're trying to stop social movements from happening, okay? Which is an important distinction. And is interesting as a strategy, interesting insight into what the Chinese government really is up to. And that's just one example of the kind of research that can be done with, again, these kind of big data. All right. So enough about the statistical analysis. The third logic of inquiry that Leipart focused on, case studies, is one of the most natural for people to do political research. Go and learn a lot about it. Right? Read the documents, go to the archives, read about things, follow the media, read the newspapers of the time, whatever it might be. Really get to know as many aspects of the place or the phenomenon as you can, so that you, with that knowledge, can say, well, to me it seems like this story is well supported and that other story is not. Okay, and you can make a case based on just simply portraying how things happen. Yesterday when I talked about historical institutionalism, and I talked about how they focus on periods of change and then periods of no change or slow change in the life of an organization or the life of a country or something else. Well, that's a theory. Those kind of theories tend to be very good for using case studies, for studying things in great depth. The problem for case study research is, from the point of view of creating good general theories, is that case studies can often just be too specific. They're not very general. If you go in and you study everything about Uruguay in the 1970s, you can create a very compelling story about what explains the development of politics in Uruguay in the 1970s, but then that may be of no value or no interest to people interested in other countries. Okay, so generalization is less valuable there. The case studies tend to control for things by simply the judgment of the scholar doing the research. Okay, and sometimes other scholars will say, you do not do that as well as you could have. There are actually now, there has been more thinking and more writing about how do we do case studies in ways that we really do contribute to general theories. So that what I find in Uruguay in the 1970s really helps people understand other countries and other times. Okay, so I think that's one of the developments in case studies research, that idea of making case studies into something that really help us have general theories. That's been a big focus in political science in recent years. Okay. The final logic of inquiry is what Leipart called the comparative method. Again, it's multiple case studies. And that was the whole point of his article, was to try to say that a lot of what political scientists do is this comparative method. They will compare different things, different countries, different leaders, different time periods, and they'll do it with great depth of information about each one. But they will then look across their cases, across their case studies, and try to learn from the similarities and differences among them. Okay, and that takes, there's specific ways you can do that that allow you to actually control for certain things and to support your theories, and that in that sense have their own logic of inquiry. You need to choose which cases you study very carefully. You want, if you're going to study 4 countries, you need to think to yourself, why do I want to study these 4? And to pick countries, hopefully, that are similar in some ways to each other and different in other ways. Because you're going to end up saying that I conclude that this theory is supported because the 2 countries that are similar, both something happens in both of them, whereas the countries that are different do not. And so you're going to be looking across the cases and sort of saying, well, these 2, we don't see this phenomenon, but these other 2 we do. And from those kind of comparisons across cases, you're going to be making assertions about what causes certain kinds of political outcomes. Right? And so, much like experimental research, if you're doing comparative method research, you have to start by setting up your research, picking what you will do, selecting your cases very carefully. Okay, so a lot of it has to happen before you go out and get your information. You have to have decided, well, I'm going to do it in the following way. That's called research design. Right, so the idea of research design is very important in a comparative method study. But it's very commonly used in all sorts of topics, and it is, of course, a great way to combine richness of detail about a situation with an attempt to really learn some things that are of general value. Now, the thing that is, I think, most greatly valued now is if you can take advantage of more than one of the 4 logics that Leibhardt put forward. Right? Each has advantages and each has disadvantages. But again, especially in a longer study, there's a lot of reason to think that you can get value from doing both. Okay, so in terms of doing political science research, one of the things that is that we often recommend for students who are beginning their research and for others is to not just pick one. Okay, do 2. Start with a statistical analysis, which shows large patterns, but does not have a lot of interesting information about each particular case. Right? So find the general overall pattern through statistics, and then select some of your cases and go into greater depth. Okay, so that's one way, for example, to combine that. That idea of combining these different logics and getting the benefits of more than one is usually called the mixed method or multi-method approach, and it's something that is sort of widely supported. One final term I want to mention as being, I think, a particularly big issue now among people who think about these sorts of things in political science, the people who are trying to create better methods for us to do our research, is this idea of causal inference. So causal inference is what every political scientist does, because it's just the idea of how do we determine that A causes B, but C does not cause B, okay? Or that X causes A, but Y does not cause A. Right? It's the idea of ruling in certain factors, ruling out other factors, picking out what actually is causing something to happen. That's all causal inference means. But the term as it's being used now in debates within political science has a very specific meaning. And it is that there's a group of scholars in political science who believe that the statistical research, even when it's done very well, even when it's very sophisticated and done in a way that that takes into account all the necessary assumptions and that really meets all the standards of doing high sophisticated analysis, that statistics nonetheless doesn't do a very good job of telling us whether A causes B. And the problem is that you may know the expression that correlation is not causation. So if we find out in the real world that this factor is correlated with that, I don't know, tallness is correlated with success at basketball, that doesn't necessarily prove that this thing is the cause of that thing. Because it might be that it's a spurious relationship, that both things are actually caused by some third factor. Or it might be something where the relationship is more complex. Or it might be that the thing you thought was the result is actually the cause. You don't know about which direction causation works. There's a lot of questions that are left. People who do statistical analysis, they say, aha, but I have a theory. And my theory, which is a good story that I thought of, my story says that it should be like this. So if I go out and find statistically that the patterns in the real world match my story, then I say, yeah, my story is right. But now there's this group of scholars who are saying, well, I don't know. I'm not so sure that that's enough. I think that we need to have better ways to prove that our story is a strong one and our theory is correct. And what these people who are in favor of causal inference methods, what they say is important, is really to engage in things that are like experiments, to use the same logic of experiments. And that means that you have to very actively control which data you use, and not just use statistics to analyze it, but actually, before you begin, to manipulate the data in some way. So in some way that is like an experiment, or a natural experiment, or a quasi-experiment, or something. And so they're beginning to develop these new set of procedures that are based on learning about the world, using numbers, quantitative research, but in an experiment-like way. So I think I won't go into more detail on that. You can certainly ask me more about it in question period if you'd like. But it is a very interesting thing because for 50 years or more, statistical analysis has been assumed to be a pretty effective way to study politics. And now there's a group of very sophisticated scholars who are saying, not so fast. Maybe we need to do different ways of analyzing our data. So there you have it, a variety of research methods that have come to the fore. They're not all quantitative, okay, so they're both quantitative and qualitative, but in all of the areas, whether quantitative or qualitative, case studies, experimental, what have you, the political science discipline is thinking a lot and writing a lot about how do we do this better. Okay, so I encourage you, if you're going to study politics in one form or another, that you really try to say, how do I learn from these recent works to use the most appropriate and most sophisticated method I can. All right, in just a very brief time, I will end by talking about this question of how to get an article published in a political science journal. Right, and so that's these journal articles are the standard way that in political science people communicate their work. Books, research monographs are the other major way, but books take a long time to write. They're a slow form of communication. Even people who write books regularly will often contribute articles in between books or parts. What will become later a part of a book is published as a research article. So articles, in a sense, are one of the key ways that we share our ideas and our arguments with other scholars. And there are certain ways to get published in a journal that I think are quite straightforward. And as I said yesterday, I would very much hope that we see more contributions in English language journals around the world, published not just in the US or Europe, but elsewhere in the world, that provide a vehicle for sharing research done by Russian political scientists. So let me review some things, and hopefully in just a few minutes. The first thing is, I want to show you, this is from a political science journal, a strong political science journal, United States-based one. This is what, so when you submit an article to a journal, they take the article and they send it out to scholars who are experts in that area, and they ask the experts to evaluate the manuscript, the potential article. Okay, that's called to be a referee for the article. And when you serve as a referee, you do not know who wrote the manuscript. Okay, so it's anonymous, and the author of the manuscript will not know who the referees are. So when I was asked a few months ago to be a referee for this journal, they sent me a manuscript, so I did not know who wrote the article. And they said, is this, this is what they asked me to consider. It's actually kind of bright. I hope you can see those slides. So number one is about theory. They want you to have a story about politics, about your question. They want to know, what is it you're saying theoretically? They don't want it to be just descriptive. Second thing about that question, that idea of having a question, etc. Okay. Then some of the others, is it broad interest, etc. Number four, do you use the right methods? Have you gone from a question to the method? So, in other words, what I'm saying is that a lot of times the way that we, as scholars, are asked to evaluate things to be published in a journal covers a lot of the same ground that I have today. Does the have you, in writing this, really made clear that here's this interesting question, here's why we should try to answer it. In light of the question, I've gone ahead and tried to study the world in this following way. I've tried to use the best possible methods and to really be sensitive to doing it correctly so that I can draw conclusions and feel like I'm on good solid ground in saying, yes, I think this is the cause of this. This is the real reason why this is right. So, what I want to say more generally is that the steps you ought to follow, I can sort of outline them as steps, and they go as follows. Let me see if I can do this fairly briefly. So, you do your research and you write up an article manuscript. In the suggested readings document, I actually have a short list of suggested ways to organize your manuscript as an article. But so you have this thing and you think, oh, this is very interesting. I found something that I really like. I want to get it published as a journal article. Okay. So here's my strategy for turning your manuscript into a published article. Okay. So the first thing is pick out not one, but 3 or 4 journals that are appropriate for your research. That is, they publish that kind of research. You can look at their recent issues, see if it's actually the kind of journal where you should be publishing that research. Find the most prestigious one you can that publishes your kind of research, as well as some others that maybe are less prestigious, but also appropriate for your research. Okay. So go out and research them and find what they want, what kind of articles they like, and make yourself a list, but not just one, 2, 3, or 4 journals. Okay? Then start with the top one. Aim high. Shoot for the very best journal you can, the most prestigious, the best known around the world, and submit your article to that journal. So send it to the place that you would most like it to appear. So it's a little bit radical maybe, especially if you're not confident in your skills. But I say send it to the journal that's very highly ranked. And this is a very important part of it here. Send it. Do submit it. Because it is the case that 100% of manuscripts that do not get submitted are not published as articles. Okay. So if you don't send it to the editor can't publish it in the journal. And it's actually sometimes hard emotionally to say, okay, now I'm done, and now I'm ready, and I will really submit it. But go ahead and submit it. So there are two options if you submit your article to a journal, which is usually done electronically, usually by email or a web-based submission thing. So submitting it takes 5 minutes. Well, maybe not quite so little, but pretty easy mechanically. So there are two outcomes of submitting it. One, you get a rejection. And if you get a rejection, you go to journal number 2. Don't wait very long. I always give myself 1 day to be sad and to tell myself that if I get a rejection from a journal, so I spend 1 day being very sad and saying that, well, maybe I should not be a political scientist after all. I should give up and go become a janitor or something. But then on day 2, I have a sleep and I feel better, and I say, okay, everybody who didn't understand my research and criticized it probably was wrong, and I can just forget them, and now I will submit it to a new journal. Okay, so I'm joking about that a little bit. I actually advocate that you make changes that you think are good changes, because you may get back ideas from the journal that you actually like and want to do. So go ahead and make those changes, but do it quickly. Do it within 1 month or less. And then submit it to your second journal. Okay, and keep going down your list. It's very common for people who publish articles regularly to have those articles be rejected by 2 or 3 or more journals before they finally find one that accepts it. Because it is a human process, and you just can't tell who will be doing the decisions and why they make their decisions. And sometimes a very good article will be rejected in one place and accepted in another. So you just need to keep trying. You can do it, usually it takes about 3 months to get your answer after you submit a journal. So it can take a year. You can do 4 journals in a year. Okay, and that's not very long to have an article published. Finish writing the article, and a year later it's been accepted for publication, and we consider that, that's a great victory. The second outcome might be that you get it accepted. I should have said there are 3 possible outcomes. The second is that you get it accepted. That's actually not very common. Very few articles get accepted. Very rarely do you get an email back from the editor, and the editor says, great, we love it. We're going to publish it. Okay. Even the most famous authors in political science, they don't get those emails very often. Instead, they get the third possible response, which is revise and resubmit. Okay, that's the English phrase, revise and resubmit. It means this maybe has possibilities. This is the editor talking. This to you. So, Mr. Scholar, your manuscript has possibilities, but it's not quite ready yet. I want you to do this, this, and this. Send it back to me, and if I like what you did, then I will publish it. So it's half acceptance. If you get that response, it's usually a good idea to work with the editor and make the changes that the editor suggests and try to send it back to that journal. Because a revise and resubmit is way ahead of nothing at all. Okay, so you're halfway there when you have a revise and resubmit from the editor, and you know what work you need to do. The editor has told you, make these changes, and then it will be acceptable. And again, I think at least 90% of every article you see in a major political science journal had to make revisions before it was accepted. So the overall strategy is submit your article, keep submitting it until it's accepted. If you get a revise and resubmit, do the work and send it back to that editor, but keep going. Right? don't give up. Right? So that all successful scholars in political science get rejected very frequently, and they keep trying, and then eventually their articles are published. So let me conclude by just repeating, I've tried to describe to you a way to do research that is kind of the overarching way of asking a question, thinking about a theory, selecting a research method that will help you answer that theory and really demonstrate that your answer is the correct one. And then writing that up in ways to highlight what you've done and why it's good, and submitting it to the journals. I've also tried to build in some overview of the different options you have for picking those really good research methods. Okay? So I hope that will help you because, of course, it doesn't get into the specifics of any one type of research, but it is really representative of the approach that you take for publication more generally. So with that, I will stop and thank you for your attention. And as with yesterday, I'm very happy to answer your questions.
Any questions, please?
This way.
I have a question. Thank you for your interesting and useful lecture. I have a question about statistical analysis. What do you think about public opinion resources? Are they representative resources, or we should use them carefully in our political researches?
Well, they vary a lot. So it depends on how they're collected and which agency does it and for what purpose. For example, in the United States, and I think also in Russia and in many countries, there's a clear distinction between the public opinion surveys that are done for academic purposes, for scholars, and then those that are done for use by newspapers and campaigns and politicians and others. Sometimes the ones that are done for campaign purposes are very specific, and they're only interested in one type of person, and you can't really judge the whole country from that, or they're done, they ask questions in very specific biased ways and other things. So there are high-quality organizations that conduct surveys in ways that I think are very good, very reliable, and yes, you can use those, and they have a record of being very accurate about the state of public opinion. So I think the question is to, can you get data from very good sources? And if those good surveys will ask the questions that you want, right? If they have the kind of information you want. But hopefully they do. But there's a lot of good firms that do survey research.
Any other questions, please?
Am I right that statistical analysis, it is an inductive method of analysis?
No. So it can be either. Right? You can use statistics for inductive research or deductive research. Mm-hmm. The deductive research that I was describing really involves you coming up with theory first, making predictions based on your theory. Right? If my story is correct, then we'll see this, this, and this out there in the world. And then using the statistics to go see that. And so if you start first from theory and operate deductively, statistics still help you. They help clear away the noise, what's called noise, the things that are distractions, that are not useful. So you can focus in on the relationships that matter. And and that's very deductive. But of course, some people can use quantitative analysis, let's say that, some kinds of statistics, for purely inductive purposes. So maybe I go out and I get a public opinion survey, national survey that represents the views of different Americans. And I want to know, I just want to know the correlation between one's occupation and one's party preference. right? Do people who work in blue collar or industrial work, do they vote for Democrats and rich people vote for Republicans or something? I just want to know the correlation. That's very inductive, right? I don't have a story or a theory or anything. So I just go I do a correlation, right? Or some sort of cross tabulation or something, right? And so yes, that's statistics that's inductive, but very often it's used to test a deductive theory. So I guess, using statistics doesn't tell you which is which.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Please.
Yes, thank you so much again. How you would measure the success of political theory, and what are the tips for the political theory to be successful? Because all we know that there are examples in our political researchers, that some researchers got very popular, and then it turned out they're not relevant anymore.
How do we evaluate this? So you rely on those logics of inquiry. So you have to make a case when you as a scholar, so I'm thinking about myself as a scholar, I am trying to convince other scholars and others with an interest in that topic that my answer is the correct one. And I have to do that by saying the alternative answers are incorrect. Again, so I have to show in my study that if the other answers were correct, I would not have these results. But because I have these results, my answer is correct. And so it's a matter of persuasion. Ultimately, it's judgment of a large number of other people. And even if it's accepted as very valid and very correct at one time, we still are not 100% sure. Now, sometimes one theory that's very popular turns out to later prove not useful, but that's because the conditions in which it was correct have changed, and so now it's no longer correct. So maybe there's a pattern where you say, so we have this theory called modernization theory, which became popular to explain why in some countries there is certain kinds of politics and civil society and social movements and democratization movements and other things that comes out of the level of economic development of the country. And it actually was very useful in the 1950s and the 1960s. Well, then the world changes, and by today, maybe it's not so useful. A lot of people don't think it fits anymore. Why? Because the global economy has changed, etc. And so that means that we need to tell a slightly different story. We need a new theory because we want it to cover both the old time and the new time. So somehow, that's not necessarily saying that the old theory was wrong. It's, excuse me. It's saying that the old theory was limited, or was for a certain time only. Excuse me.
Any other questions? I guess this is it. We're running out of time. Professor Raizinger, thank you very much for your lecture. We really appreciate it.
Thank you all.
And we'd like to invite everybody tomorrow, also at the same time, at the same location here, 17:30. Zauča Universiteta is the last lecture of Professor Raizinger. Thank you for coming.